You know, I've often wondered if there's a special place in the afterlife reserved for HOA presidents. A little cul-de-sac of eternal torment where the paint swatches are always just off, the lawn gnomes stage daily rebellions, and the trash cans are perpetually left out 3 hours past the designated collection window. But Alistister Thorne, the president of the Whispering Pines Estates, oh, the man who decided my rustic little cabin was an affront to his beige-tinted universe? He wasn't just aiming for that special cul-de-sac. He was gunning for the whole darn infernal subdivision. He, along with his band of merry arsonists, burned my cabin to the ground. Their goal, as far as I could tell, was to force me out, to erase a perceived blight from their meticulously curated landscape. What they didn't count on was the California wind, or perhaps the sheer explosive stupidity of their plan. The fire didn't just take my cabin. It roared into the adjoining national forest, charring tens of thousands of acres. Now, those HOA goons aren't just facing my wrath. They're looking at life in prison and owe so much money in damages to me and the state that their great-grandchildren will be paying it off. It's a crazy story, almost too unbelievable for fiction, but every word of it is true. Drop a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. And tell me, what's the most outrageous thing an HOA has ever tried to pull on you? I have a feeling this one might just reset the bar. My cabin wasn't much to look at. Not if your tastes ran to the sprawling McMansions that had begun to metastasize on the periphery of the Stanislaus National Forest. It was small, built by my grandfather with his own hands in the 50s, using timber milled from trees that had fallen naturally on the modest parcel of land he'd bought for a song. It was off-grid before off-grid was cool, a wood stove for heat, a composting toilet that was surprisingly efficient, and a gravity-fed water system from a spring higher up the slope. The electricity came from a couple of solar panels I'd installed, just enough to power a small fridge, lights, and my laptop. For me, an aerospace engineer accustomed to the relentless precision and high-stakes pressure of my day job, that cabin was sanctuary. It was where I went to decompress, to hear nothing but the wind in the pines and the crackle of the fire. The land it sat on, about 5 acres, bordered the national forest on one side, and an old, rarely used county access road on another. Crucially, it was not part of Whispering Pines Estates, a relatively new development that had sprung up about a quarter-mile down the main paved road, aspiring to be some sort of exclusive mountain retreat. I first encountered Alistister Thorne about 2 years after he'd apparently been crowned King of Whispering Pines. I was coming back from a hike, probably looking a bit like a Sasquatch myself after a week in the woods, when a gleaming, obscenely large white SUV, the kind that probably had its own zip code, crunched to a halt on the gravel turnout near my property line. Thorne emerged. He was a man who looked like he'd been squeezed into clothes a size too small, his face perpetually flushed, as if he were mid-argument with his own circulatory system. He wore a pastel pink golf shirt, blindingly white slacks that screamed, "No actual work done here," and a visor that seemed to be actively rejecting his thinning, meticulously brill-creamed hair. His smile didn't reach his eyes, which were small, assessing, and held a distinct glint of disapproval as they swept over me, and then lingered on my cabin, visible through the trees. "Afternoon," he boomed, his voice a little too loud, a little too confident. Alistister Thorne, president of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. He extended a hand, and his grip was surprisingly weak, like shaking hands with a damp sponge. I introduced myself, explaining I wasn't part of his association. "Ah, yes," he said, that smile tightening. "The rustic place. Quaint." The word quaint was delivered with the same enthusiasm one might reserve for discovering a patch of particularly virulent mold. We at Whispering Pines are dedicated to maintaining a certain aesthetic, a standard, you understand. Property values, community harmony. I nodded, already sensing where this was going. He then launched into a not-so-subtle monologue about the benefits of modernizing, of integrating with the community standards, perhaps even considering selling to someone who might build something more appropriate. I politely told him I liked my cabin just the way it was, that it held sentimental value, and that its appropriateness was a matter of my own satisfaction, not his HOA's bylaws. His eye twitched, just once, but it was enough. The man was clearly unaccustomed to not getting his way. Over the next few months, the pressure was subtle but persistent. Flyers for local construction companies specializing in luxury mountain homes would appear tucked into my ancient mailbox. Once, an overly cheerful real estate agent, reeking of desperation and expensive perfume, left a glossy brochure on my porch, detailing how much a properly developed lot like mine could fetch. Then came the friendly visits from other Whispering Pines residents, usually Thorne's acolytes. There was Brenda, Thorne's vice president, a woman whose face seemed permanently frozen in an expression of pursed disapproval, her oversized sunglasses shielding her from the horrors of anything not beige or taupe. She'd coo about how a nice new build would really elevate the whole area. I always offered them coffee, which they always declined, probably fearing it wasn't organic, single origin, or served in an approved Pantone color mug. One evening, old Jedediah, who lived in a slightly less rustic but equally independent cabin further down the county road, flagged me down. Jedediah had been in these mountains since before Whispering Pines was even a twinkle in some developer's greedy eye. "Heard Thorne's been sniffing around your place," he said, his voice raspy. "Watch yourself with that one, son. He plays dirty. Thinks that HOA chairmanship makes him king of the mountain. He tried to get the county to condemn my woodshed last year, said it was a blight. Took a lawyer to make him back off." That was the first real knot of unease in my stomach. I'm an engineer, as I said. My mind works on logic, on data, on predictable outcomes based on established principles. People like Thorne, driven by ego and a bizarre aesthetic tyranny, were an unpredictable variable, a chaotic element I found deeply unsettling. I prided myself on being patient, methodical. I wasn't one for confrontation, but I also wasn't one to be pushed around, especially when it came to something as personal as my grandfather's legacy. I figured Thorne would eventually tire of his polite little siege and move on to harassing some other poor soul who dared to plant unapproved petunias. I drastically underestimated his capacity for malicious obsession and the lengths to which he would go to achieve his vision of a perfectly homogenized, Thorne-approved world. The first official salvo from Whispering Pines Estates arrived via certified mail, a method so aggressive it felt like Thorne himself was leaping out of the envelope, brandishing a tiny, rule-book-shaped spear. The letter, printed on ostentatiously thick, cream-colored paper bearing the HOA's pretentious logo, a stylized pine tree that looked suspiciously like a rejected Christmas ornament, grandly announced that a historical review of county records had revealed that my property, due to an obscure covenant dating back to the original land grants of 1927, was, in fact, subject to the architectural and maintenance standards of Whispering Pines Estates. It was accompanied by a ludicrously complex, jargon-filled document that looked like it had been drafted by a team of particularly bored and vindictive lawyers. I'm an engineer, not a legal scholar, but I know how to research. I spent the next weekend buried in online county databases, cross-referencing parcel maps, and even managed to pull up digital copies of the original land grants from the early 20th century. Unsurprisingly, Thorne's obscure covenant was pure fiction. My property had never been part of any parcel that Whispering Pines was carved from. Its chain of title was entirely separate, clean, and unencumbered by their petty regulations. I drafted a polite but firm response, complete with copies of the relevant documents, pointing out their error and respectfully requesting they cease their baseless claims. I sent it via certified mail, return receipt requested, just to add a little official seasoning of my own. Thorne's reply was not a letter of apology or correction. Instead, the violation notices started. Failure to maintain exterior siding in accordance with community standards, Section 4, Subsection B. Paragraph 3. Aesthetic harmony. Unapproved vegetation visible from designated community pathways. Schedule C. Plant list. Revised. Non-compliant roofing materials, historical preservation addendum, spurious. Each notice threatened escalating fines, liens against my property, and even, hilariously, aesthetic remediation at my expense. The irony was rich. The designated community pathways, from which my cabin was allegedly offending delicate sensibilities, were at least a quarter-mile away, separated by dense woods. And their historical preservation addendum seemed to conveniently ignore the actual history of my cabin in favor of some imagined upscale pioneer chic. One notice particularly galled me. Accumulation of natural forest debris posing a significant fire hazard. Community Safety Mandate 7.2. My property was, if anything, more diligently managed for fire safety than their manicured, water-guzzling lawns. I kept a defensible space cleared around the cabin, limbed up trees, and regularly cleared brush, all per CAL FIRE guidelines. It was clear Thorne wasn't interested in facts or safety. He was interested in harassment. This is where my engineering mindset kicked in. If this was going to be a battle of attrition, I needed data. I started documenting everything. Every flyer, every notice, every unsolicited visit was logged with dates, times, and summaries of interactions. I took photographs, time-stamped of my property from various angles, clearly showing its condition and the surrounding landscape. Then I invested in a few high-quality, motion-activated trail cameras. I strategically placed them overlooking my driveway, the approaches to my cabin, and one even pointing back towards the general direction of Whispering Pines, capturing a section of the old county road they sometimes used as a shortcut. These weren't cheap, obvious security cameras. They were camouflaged, designed for wildlife observation, and virtually invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. I also made a point of being more visible when I was there, ensuring neighbors on the non-HOA side knew I was around and actively caring for my place. I even had a friendly chat with a local sheriff's deputy I knew from a search and rescue volunteer group I occasionally helped, just to casually mention the escalating, unwarranted attention from the HOA. He listened, made a few notes, and advised me to keep meticulous records, which I was already doing. The petty acts of sabotage began shortly after I'd refuted their bogus covenant claim. One weekend, I arrived to find my property line markers, which had been in place for decades, pulled up and tossed into the bushes. Another time, a small pile of household trash, a ripped plastic bag containing fast food wrappers and empty beer cans, definitely not my brand, was dumped just inside my gate. I photographed it, logged it, and cleaned it up. Then came the anonymous complaints. The county code enforcement officer, a weary-looking man named Dave, paid me a visit. Got a complaint about, an unpermitted structure, he said, consulting his clipboard, clearly skeptical. He meant my woodshed, which was older than he was. I showed him the original plot plan and explained its history. He sighed, ticked a box, and left. A week later, it was animal control, responding to a report of vicious, barking dogs. I owned a goldfish at the time, and he was notoriously silent. Each visit was a minor annoyance, a disruption, but also another entry in my growing logbook. Thorne was clearly trying to wear me down, to make my peaceful retreat a source of constant irritation. The final warning, if you could call it that, came not from Thorne directly, but from his hulking, perpetually silent vice president, a man named Gus whose neck was wider than his head. I was splitting firewood one Saturday morning when Gus's oversized pickup truck, a caricature of aggressive masculinity, rumbled to a stop at my gate. He didn't get out, just idled there, his window down, staring. Gus wasn't a talker. He was Thorne's muscle, the physical embodiment of the HOA's intimidation tactics. After a few long minutes of him just sitting there, emanating wordless menace, he put the truck in gear, gave a single, curt nod that could have meant anything from nice weather to you're next, and drove off. I noted it in my log. October 14th, 11:32 a.m. Visit from Gus. No verbal communication, possible intimidation attempt. I felt a chill then, a sense that this was moving beyond bureaucratic bullying. 2 weeks later, I was in Pasadena for a critical project review at work. It was a Wednesday. My phone rang just after 10 p.m. It was Maria, my closest neighbor on the non-HOA side. Her voice frantic. "Your cabin! It's on fire! The whole hillside is going up." My blood ran cold. I remember gripping the phone, the sterile hotel room suddenly feeling like a collapsing tunnel. Pasadena to my cabin was a 3-hour drive, minimum. There was nothing I could do but listen to Maria's panicked updates, the distant sound of sirens wailing in the background of her call. By the time I arrived in the pre-dawn hours, the sight was apocalyptic. My little piece of heaven was a smoking ruin, a blackened scar on the earth. The fire hadn't stopped there. Fueled by dry conditions and a strong easterly wind, it had leaped the old county road and was now raging through the Stanislaus National Forest. Fire crews were everywhere, the air thick with smoke, the night sky glowing an angry orange. The devastation was absolute. My grandfather's legacy, my sanctuary, gone. But amidst the shock and the profound gut-wrenching grief, a single cold thought began to crystallize. Thorne. This had his slimy, manicured fingerprints all over it. The official line from the early fire reports was, "'Cause undetermined, investigation ongoing," but the battalion chief I spoke to, a seasoned firefighter with tired eyes, admitted off the record that the initial burn patterns around my cabin looked damned suspicious. The fact that the fire had spread so catastrophically into federal land meant this wasn't just a local matter anymore. State and federal investigators were already en route. My personal tragedy had just become a major environmental disaster, and my resolve to find the truth, to bring whoever did this to justice, hardened into something like tempered steel. My engineering mind, the part of me that thrived on dissecting complex problems, was already kicking into high gear. Thorne wanted a war. He was about to get one he was utterly unprepared for. The ashes of my cabin were still warm when my suspicion, a cold, hard certainty, settled on Alistister Thorne. Grief was a heavy cloak, but beneath it, my methodical nature was already stirring. This wasn't just about a lost building. This was about an assault, a malicious act designed to drive me out, and it had catastrophically backfired on the perpetrators, threatening a vast expanse of pristine wilderness. The local fire captain, a man named Rodriguez, whose face was etched with fatigue and soot, had pulled me aside at the perimeter. "Look," he'd said, his voice low, "officially, we don't know yet, but this thing started hot and fast right at your structure. Too hot, too fast for accidental, given the conditions leading up to it." He couldn't say more, but it was enough. My first call, even before I fully processed the smoldering ruin, was to my lawyer, Arthur Jenkins. Arthur was a sharp, no-nonsense attorney who'd handled a patent dispute for me years ago. He wasn't a criminal lawyer, but he knew people who were, and more importantly, he knew how to navigate the bureaucracy and how to put pressure where it needed to be. He listened patiently to my recounting of Thorne's escalating harassment, his voice growing grimmer with each detail. "Document everything you told me, every interaction, every notice," he advised. "And I mean everything. We'll need it." I told him I already had a meticulously kept log with dates, times, photos, and even recordings of some of the more egregious verbal encounters I'd had on my property line. My second priority was my trail cameras. The fire had been intense, but I'd placed them strategically, some well away from the cabin itself, hidden in spots I doubted even a dedicated searcher would find, unless they knew my land intimately. The one covering the main approach to the cabin was likely toast, but two others, one monitoring a lesser-used game trail that skirted my property and could offer a stealthy approach, and another overlooking the old county road towards Whispering Pines, might have survived. The following day, after the immediate area around the cabin was declared safe enough to access with an escort, I went back. The main camera was a melted plastic lump, as expected. But the one on the game trail, shielded by a thick oak that had somehow, miraculously, only been scorched on one side, was intact. Its camouflage casing was singed, but the SD card inside was pristine. The camera overlooking the county road was also fine. That night, back in a soulless motel room, I plugged the SD cards into my laptop. My heart hammered as I clicked through the files. The game trail camera was the first jackpot. Time-stamped at 2:17 a.m. on the night of the fire, it showed two figures. They were heavily bundled in dark clothing, hoods up, faces obscured, but their builds were distinct. One was tall and lanky, the other shorter, stockier. The stocky one carried a jerry can. Not the red plastic kind for gasoline, but one of those yellow diesel cans. Or so it appeared in the infrared. They were moving purposefully towards my cabin. My hands were shaking. This was it. This was the beginning of the proof. The camera on the county road showed a dark-colored SUV, consistent with Thorne's vehicle. Though the license plate wasn't clear, driving away from the direction of my cabin at approximately 3:05 a.m., roughly 45 minutes after the figures were spotted and, according to initial fire crew estimates, about 20 minutes after the fire would have truly taken hold. Circumstantial for the SUV, but the figures with the jerry can, that was gold. Arthur put me in touch with a retired arson investigator, a grizzled veteran named Frank Holloway, who now worked as a private consultant. Frank agreed to look at my footage and visit the site, with official permission, of course. While state and federal investigators, U.S. Forest Service and CAL FIRE arson units, were conducting their own painstaking, by-the-book inquiry, Frank could move faster on specific leads I provided. He confirmed my suspicion about the jerrycan. Diesel alone is a slow starter, Frank mused, examining the enhanced stills from my trail cam. But mix it with gasoline, or use it as an accelerant with something more volatile to get it going, and it burns hotter and longer. Professionals sometimes use it because it's less explosive, gives them more time to get away. These guys weren't necessarily pros, but they weren't rank amateurs either. He also pointed out something I'd missed. The lanky figure wore a very specific type of work boot, one with a distinctive tread pattern visible in a frame where he'd stepped in a patch of soft mud. We might get lucky with that, Frank said. My next step was to find a weak link in Thorne's chain. I remembered Jedediah's warning about Thorne playing dirty. I also recalled a conversation with Maria, my neighbor, months ago. She'd mentioned that the HOA had recently fired their longtime landscaping contractor, a local guy named Pete, after a dispute over an invoice. Thorne apparently had tried to stiff him for a substantial amount of work. Pete, she'd said, was furious. I found Pete's number. He was initially wary, but when I explained that I was the owner of the cabin that had burned down and that I suspected Thorne and the HOA were involved, his tone changed. That Thorne, Pete spat. He's a snake. A cheap, arrogant snake. He accused me of overcharging, of damaging some fancy sprinkler head. Lies. All of it. He just didn't want to pay what he owed. Pete told me about the HOA board meetings he'd sometimes inadvertently overheard snippets of while working near the clubhouse. Thorne was apparently obsessed with my cabin, referring to it as the hovel, and that eyesore. He'd openly discussed ways to encourage me to sell or bring the property into compliance. Pete recalled Thorne once boasting, "There are ways to deal with uncooperative elements. One way or another, that dump will go." While not a smoking gun for arson, it established motive and premeditation in Thorne's own words, witnessed by a credible third party. Pete was more than willing to provide a sworn affidavit. Meanwhile, Thorne and the Whispering Pines HOA were putting on a masterclass in feigned sympathy and insidious blame-shifting. Thorne even gave an interview to the local paper, his face a mask of solemn concern. A true tragedy, he'd clucked, adjusting his perfectly knotted silk tie, which looked jarringly out of place against the backdrop of the still smoldering forest. It just underscores the importance of stringent fire safety measures, which we, at Whispering Pines, take very seriously. Older, unmaintained properties, especially those bordering our precious wilderness, can pose such a significant risk. The implication was clear. I was to blame. My unmaintained cabin had supposedly endangered them all. The sheer audacity was breathtaking. This, from the man whose goons were caught on my camera sneaking onto my property with accelerants. The local community, however, wasn't entirely buying it. Many knew my family had owned that land for generations, knew I was meticulous. Whispers were starting, fueled by Jedediah and others who'd had run-ins with Thorne's brand of neighborhood tyranny. The narrative Thorne was trying to spin was already starting to fray at the edges, even before my evidence truly came into play. The official investigation was slow but thorough, sifting through debris, interviewing potential witnesses. They found traces of accelerant, a diesel and gasoline mix, just as Frank had theorized, concentrated at several points around the cabin's foundation. The noose was slowly, almost imperceptibly, beginning to tighten. Armed with the trail camera footage, Pete, the landscaper's sworn affidavit, detailing Thorne's animosity and veiled threats, and Frank Holloway's preliminary analysis of the burn patterns and potential accelerants, Arthur Jenkins arranged a meeting. Not with the local sheriff's office, but directly with the lead investigator from the U.S. Forest Service Law Enforcement and Investigations Branch, a stern, no-nonsense woman named Agent Ramirez, and the supervising CAL FIRE arson investigator, Captain Davies. Given that a significant portion of the Stanislaus National Forest was now a blackened wasteland, their agencies had primary jurisdiction, and they were playing for keeps. We met in a sterile conference room at a temporary command post set up near the fire zone. I laid out my evidence systematically: the history of Thorne's harassment, the bogus covenant claim, the escalating violation notices, the acts of minor sabotage, the veiled threats, and finally, the trail cam footage. I watched their faces as the video played. The two shadowy figures, the jerrycan, the furtive movements in the dead of night. Agent Ramirez leaned forward, her eyes fixed on the screen. Captain Davies scribbled notes, his expression unreadable but intense. When I finished with Pete's affidavit and Frank's initial findings, including the distinctive boot print, the room was silent for a long moment. Agent Ramirez finally looked at me. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, her voice devoid of any inflection, "thank you for bringing this to our attention. This is significant." That meeting was the tipping point. The official investigation, which had been broad, now had a laser focus. Alistister Thorne and the Whispering Pines HOA. Search warrants were quietly obtained. One of the first places they hit was the home of the HOA's vice president, Gus, the silent, intimidating hulk. It turned out the shorter, stockier figure from my trail cam footage bore a striking resemblance to Gus, and in Gus's garage, tucked away beneath a pile of greasy rags, they found a pair of work boots. The tread pattern was a perfect match for the print Frank Holloway had identified near my cabin. They also found a collection of yellow diesel cans, one of which still contained a trace amount of a diesel-gasoline mixture consistent with the samples taken from my property. Gus, despite his imposing physique, apparently folded like a cheap lawn chair under interrogation, especially when faced with the prospect of federal charges for an arson that had torched federal land. He quickly implicated the tall, lanky figure as a low-level tough guy named Donnie, occasionally hired by Thorne for odd jobs that usually involved making Thorne's problems disappear. Gus claimed he was just the driver and lookout, that Donnie set the fire, and that the whole thing was Thorne's idea, Thorne's orders. He even alleged Thorne had promised them both hefty bonuses from a discretionary HOA fund once the eyesore problem was resolved. Next came the financial deep dive. Armed with Gus's confession and the warrants, investigators subpoenaed the HOA's financial records and Thorne's personal bank accounts. It was a tangled mess, but a forensic accountant, a quiet woman with an uncanny ability to make numbers sing, found the tune. There were several large undocumented cash withdrawals from the HOA's Beautification and Maintenance Fund in the weeks leading up to the fire, withdrawals personally authorized by Thorne. There was also a corresponding, unexplained cash deposit into Donnie's bank account a few days after the fire. Donnie, when confronted with Gus's betrayal and the financial evidence, sang like a canary trying out for America's Got Talent. He admitted to setting the fire, using the diesel gas mix, all under Thorne's explicit direction and promise of payment. He even described Thorne's glee when he reported the cabin was gone. Thorne, however, remained arrogantly defiant. When investigators arrived at his sprawling, ostentatiously rustic Whispering Pines mansion, which featured more stone veneer than an entire quarry. He initially tried to bluster his way out, threatening lawsuits and name-dropping local politicians he'd supposedly golfed with. He denied everything, portraying himself as a pillar of the community, a victim of circumstance, even subtly suggesting I might have burned my own cabin down for insurance money, a desperate, pathetic attempt to deflect. But his composure started to crack when they presented him with Gus's and Donnie's signed confessions, the trail cam stills, the financial links, the boot print evidence. His face, usually flushed with self-importance, went a sickly, mottled gray. His expensive Italian loafers suddenly seemed too big for him. He demanded his lawyer, but the damage was done. The investigators also seized his computers and phone. While Thorne was too slippery to leave an obvious trail of texts or emails directly ordering an arson, they found deleted search queries on his home computer from the weeks prior. How to burn down a wooden structure safely. Best accelerants for wood fires? Legal defenses for arson. It was the digital equivalent of a criminal mastermind leaving his detailed evil plan on a post-it note stuck to the fridge. The story exploded in the local and then regional media. President arrested in National Forest arson conspiracy. Whispering Pines inferno. Greed and ego fueled the flames. The headlines were brutal. Public outrage was immense, especially as the sheer scale of the environmental devastation became clear: lost wildlife habitat, potential for erosion and mudslides, years of recovery ahead, millions upon millions in firefighting costs and ecological damage. Other Whispering Pines residents were horrified, many claiming ignorance of Thorne's scheme, though a few on the board who had clearly been his enablers, like Brenda with the perma-pursed lips, suddenly found themselves under intense scrutiny and facing potential civil liabilities for negligence or even complicity. Thorne's carefully constructed kingdom, built on petty tyranny and aesthetic fascism, was crumbling around him, and all because he couldn't stand the sight of my grandfather's honest, unpretentious cabin. His underestimation of my resolve and his colossal fiery overreach were proving to be spectacularly self-destructive. The wheels of justice were now grinding, and they were grinding exceedingly fine. The arrests of Alistister Thorne, his stooge Vice President Gus, and the hired torch Donnie were swift and satisfyingly public. Thorne, attempting a perp walk in a ridiculously expensive but ill-fitting tracksuit that screamed midlife crisis, looked less like a powerful community leader and more like a deflated blimp. The ensuing legal proceedings were, for me, a masterclass in watching a bully get his overdue comeuppance on an epic scale. The criminal trial was a media circus. The prosecution, a joint effort by state and federal attorneys, laid out their case with devastating precision. My trail camera footage was played on a large screen, the shadowy figures of Gus and Donnie becoming notorious. The forensic evidence, the accelerant traces, the matched boot print, the financial trail leading from the HOA's coffers to Donnie's bank account, was irrefutable. Gus and Donnie, having flipped, testified against Thorne, painting a damning picture of his obsessive desire to remove my cabin, his meticulous planning of the arson, and his callous disregard for the potential consequences. Thorne's defense attorney tried to argue that his client was a victim of overzealous underlings and a personal vendetta by me, but it was a pathetic, threadbare argument that unraveled under the weight of the evidence. The jury deliberated for less than a day. Guilty, all three of them. Arson of an inhabited dwelling. Even though I wasn't there, it was classified as such. Conspiracy to commit arson, and multiple counts related to unlawfully causing a forest fire on federal land, including violations of the Clean Water Act due to ash and retardant runoff into nearby streams. Thorne, as the mastermind, received the stiffest sentence, 25 years to life in federal prison. Gus got 15, and Donnie got 10 for their cooperation, though cooperation felt like a generous term for rats deserting a sinking ship. The judge, in her sentencing remarks, called their actions an act of profound arrogance and environmental vandalism, driven by petty malice. I couldn't have said it better myself. Then came my civil suit. Arthur Jenkins was in his element. We sued Thorne, Gus, Donnie, and critically, the Whispering Pines Estates HOA itself, for negligence and for being the entity under which Thorne's illegal actions were facilitated. The evidence from the criminal trial was largely admissible, making our case a relative slam dunk. We sought damages for the full replacement value of my cabin and its contents, which, thanks to my meticulous inventory and grandfather's old photos, was substantial, emotional distress, and, most importantly, punitive damages to make an example of them. The jury awarded me a figure that made my eyes water: several $1 million. Enough to rebuild 10 cabins, or to ensure I never had to work another day in my life, if I so chose. Simultaneously, the state of California and the U.S. Forest Service filed their own civil suits against the convicted trio and the HOA for the astronomical costs of fighting the wildfire, the emergency reseeding efforts, the long-term environmental monitoring, and the loss of natural resources. The judgments in those cases ran into the tens of millions. Whispering Pines Estates HOA, once a bastion of beige conformity and smug superiority, was swiftly bankrupted. Its assets were seized, its manicured common areas began to look decidedly unmanicured, and the Whispering Pines sign at the entrance was eventually, ignominiously, removed. Thorne's personal assets, his oversized house, his even more oversized SUV, his collection of pastel golf shirts, all liquidated to pay a fraction of what he owed. Poetic justice has a surprisingly satisfying crunch when it lands. For me, the aftermath was a strange mix of vindication and a lingering sadness for what was lost. The money was, of course, significant, but it was never about the money. It was about the principle, about the sheer audacity of someone thinking they could just erase a part of my life, my family's history, because it didn't fit their narrow world view. I haven't rebuilt the cabin, not yet. The land is still scarred, though nature is slowly, resiliently, beginning to reclaim it. I did, however, use a considerable portion of the settlement to establish a fund dedicated to supporting local volunteer fire departments in the Sierra foothills, and to contribute to the reforestation efforts in the Stanislaus National Forest. It felt like the right thing to do, a way to bring some good out of so much destruction. I also bought a much larger, much more remote piece of land, deep in another part of the mountains, miles from any paved road, and definitely miles from any HOA. This time, the only architectural review committee will be the bears and the deer. The broader impact was also notable. The Whispering Pines debacle became a cautionary tale throughout California, a stark example of HOA overreach taken to a criminal extreme. Several local counties began reviewing their ordinances regarding HOA powers and dispute resolution, looking for ways to protect individual homeowners from tyrannical boards. Some of the more reasonable residents of the now defunct Whispering Pines even reached out, offering apologies for not speaking up sooner against Thorne's increasingly erratic behavior. They were now saddled with managing their own properties individually, a responsibility some seemed to embrace with a newfound sense of freedom. Alistister Thorne, last I heard, was adjusting poorly to life in a federal penitentiary, where the aesthetic standards are, shall we say, somewhat less flexible than even he might prefer, and where his influence extends no further than his own bunk. I doubt they allow pastel golf shirts. And so, that's how a petty tyrant's fiery attempt to enforce his version of neighborhood perfection led to his own spectacular downfall, a national forest's devastation, and my rather unexpected, if bittersweet, financial windfall. It just goes to show, you should never underestimate a quiet engineer with a good lawyer, a few well-placed trail cameras, and a deep-seated respect for both personal property and the wild places of this earth. Thanks for sticking with me through this insane journey. Don't forget to hit that like button if you found this story as wild as I lived it, and subscribe for more tales of justice served, sometimes a little overcooked.